and it's a great pleasure to be in Mexico for the first time. And the weather is wonderful. It's very British.
It's a little bit louder.
I apologize for my almost entire lack of Spanish. I'm going to speak in English. If anyone wants the written copy of the paper, I'm quite happy to give you that. And Alberto has a copy. We're all here because we know who Berkeley is, but I suspect some people don't know who Collier is. So let me first of all introduce. See, it doesn't like me standing over here. Try. Introduce Collier.
Yeah.
So I think Steve was absolutely right. Let's just do it like this. No?
No, it's not.
There.
Wait, it's working here and not here. Let me see. Oh, there it is.
Okay, we have it.
Okay, so
Still
go
not
back.
changing
That's
on
it.
here.
It's changing, right?
Huh?
Oh, what?
We have on,
El clicker no está funcionando.
it's not the,
No,
the
it's not
keyboard as well.
exactly. Es más bien la computadora no está pasando la imagen.
Esas más.
So
let me try it. And
Do you need to choose that you have it on the external monitor, or what? Which connection are you using?
well, it's getting something out.
sí,
It's
porque
just on the change.
cuando lo hacemos así, aquí sí cambia.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
there is. And
Yeah,
it's working.
we have action. We have
Okay.
technology. So let me introduce Arthur Collier, who is, by all measures, an obscure philosopher. He was born 5 years before Berkeley, in 1680, born in the rectory of Langford Manor near Salisbury. He was educated in Oxford, at Pembroke and Balliol, where he ended up with a Master of Arts degree. Of relevance here is the fact that while we often talk about the importance of Locke in the curriculum at Trinity College Dublin, when Berkeley was studying there, at the time Collier was in Oxford, it was Descartes and Malebranche who were the main recent philosophers on the curriculum. He became rector of Langford Manor and continued in that post until his death in 1732. The importance of the place is that his neighbour, the neighbouring parish, was Bemerton, where the rector was John Norris, the philosopher John Norris. And they met regularly at the court of the Bishop of Salisbury, which was quite an intellectual circle. His major publications are 3 books, and we're going to really be talking about the first one today, the Clavis Universalis. He wrote a second book, Specimen of True Philosophy, which is a meditation on the first sentence of the Bible. And I could give you a talk about that too. It's exotic in its metaphysics. And he also wrote a treatise on the Logos, a book on the first sentence of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. This appears to have been lost. In 1836, there was a summary of it published, but no actual copy appears to be in any library I've looked in yet, any library catalogue, and I've started looking for physical library. If you come across it, please tell me.
We will.
I might even persuade my library to buy it. So this is who he was. So the reason he's interesting is that he's a contemporary of Berkeley's. Notice the Clavis Universalis, published in 1713. And this is its full title. A new inquiry after truth being a demonstration of the non-existence or impossibility of an external world. So there's a convergence in their views. Exactly how much it's an interesting question. Berkeley knew of this book. So we have a letter in 1713 to Percival, inevitably, where he he comments on this book. A clergyman of Wiltshire has lately put forth a treatise wherein he advances something which had been published 3 years before. So Berkeley's only comment is, I got there first. Actually, we know it's almost exactly simultaneous. It's about 1708. They both come to the conclusion, and they both delay publication. It's not clear from this whether Berkeley had read the book or merely knew the title, okay, and knew the contents. So we don't know about what Berkeley had read. What we do know is a bit more about what Collier had read of Berkeley's, and he had definitely read the 3 dialogues. He may not have read the principles. And he writes, after the publication of his book, to a friend of his called William Lowe, that his comment about Berkeley, I would proceed so far with him, that's the person who's claiming that the view is sceptical, if he still persists to charge me of want of this, to uphold against, he writes so terribly, to uphold against him that he himself is the man who is guilty of the scepticism of denying the existence of all visible objects. Nay, that he cannot show another in the world, besides Mr. Berkeley and myself, who hold the testimony of sense to be infallible as to this point. So what Collier has done, almost uniquely amongst readers of Berkeley in 1713, is spotted the force of the anti-sceptical argument being presented by Berkeley and also Collier. So he sees that they've got the same anti-sceptical argument, which is the infallibility of sense perception. Okay, and here is the sort of claim that Collier is referring to. One of my favourites from the 3rd dialogue. I am not for turning things into ideas, but ideas into things. So the ideas you have in sense perception are the things which make up the real world. So that's the relation, but that's the kind of historical context of the interaction between the two, pretty minimal. As you've seen, I've already shown you, Collier writes terribly, Berkeley writes beautifully. Collier is painful to read. There was a big revival of Collier studies in Edinburgh in the 1830s, but apart from that, it's been largely ignored. So a standard objection to the view which is in common between Berkeley and Collier is that they haven't really answered the sceptical problem. All they've done is turn the world into the same sort of thing as the objects of imagination or dreams. So Berkeley's ideas, what Collier calls visible objects, are no more without the mind than the objects of imagination or dreaming. So they're no more real. We haven't solved the sceptical problem. Though perhaps the most famous single sentence phrase, which from this comes from Berkeley's countryman Yeats. God appointed Berkeley that proved all things a dream. So that's the objection. Of course, it wasn't new to them. We're very familiar with Berkeley's response to this objection. The classic place we find that is in section 33 of the Principles, where he finds a significant difference between the ideas of imagination and the ideas of sense. Okay? So he says, okay, I can distinguish between the two. They are different, and they're different in a way which is relevant to the claim that what we imagine isn't real and what we sense is real. The ideas of sense are allowed to have more reality in them, that is, to be more strong, orderly, and coherent than the creatures of the mind. And they are excited by the will of another, a more powerful spirit. Okay? So it's the causation is the crucial issue here for Berkeley. We cause our ideas of imagination. Some other spirit, here he's referring specifically to God, causes our ideas of sense. It's also the case that the ideas of sense are more strong, orderly, and coherent. That reflects the greater cognitive powers of the being that creates them. But there's no, in principle, reason why your imagination couldn't produce something orderly, strong, and coherent. That's presumably what the great novelists achieve. So that's Berkeley's response. We find this significant difference. What's Collier's response? Okay. Well, it's rather different. I'm going to quote from a letter here, just because this is actually a reasonably clear statement of it. In the book, it's not, it's kind of all jumbled up a bit more. I am so far, I think, from falling short of him or any of the rest of mankind in affirming and contending that the objects seen are real, or for the reality of the material, which he uses just physical, corporeal world, these things, that I declare for the existence of every imagined object. So he solves the problem by saying they're both real. Okay. And this is the in the Clavis where he's saying, so his basic principle isn't esse is percipi, it's whatever is seen is. And he says, in imagination, a centaur has or is supposed to have been seen, and as such it has existed and does or may continually exist. Or another example he gives, this imagined moon as being truly perceived, truly exists. So he doesn't see a significant difference between the ideas of imagination and the ideas of sense. What's interesting is that in Berkeley's notebooks, we do find the same view stated and then rejected. So at 473, he thinks of the objection, but then you say then a chimera does exist. I answer it does in one sense, it is imagined, but it must be well noted that existence is vulgarly restrained to actual perception. And I use the word existence in a larger sense than ordinary, and follows that up with the famous plus sign. We're not going to comment on it. NB, according to my doctrine, all things are entio rationis. All things solum habent esse in intellect. And then, on the verso side, he writes at some later date, according to my doctrine, all are not entio rationis. The distinction between ens rationis and ens reale is kept up by it. So it looks like, between writing this, at this point, he's at least toying with the Collier view. And at this point, he's explicitly stating that he's got an alternative route, which is what we see in the published works. We might just note for Steve that this looks like it's a very clear instance of plus meaning rejection. But
Clarification.
Clarification. So Berkeley toyed with Collier's view. So that's interesting. Collier's view looks like there's some internal logic to the position that they share, which drives them towards that view. And Berkeley tries to avoid that consequence. And it's clearly something to do with what we're thinking about with the word existence and how they're using the word existence. So Berkeley agrees, even in the published works, that both the ideas of imagination and the ideas of sense exist. And there's a single notion of existence for ideas, and they both exist in that sense. And they're of the same ontological kind. They're both ideas. And that's just one of the two ontological kinds. But they have some different sort of metaphysical status. One is real, the other isn't. Okay? And the difference lies in the causation. And Collier is refusing to make that metaphysical distinction within the category of the things that exist. All these things exist. That's the end of the story. They exist, so they're real. Okay. There's also an agreement here. Collier does think that if we did create the ideas of imagination, then they would in some sense be less real. So he agrees that the position that Berkeley finally adopts has some incoherence to it. Okay, but Collier's view is that God creates the ideas of imagination. Okay. So it's not us, it's God that creates the ideas of the imagination. We can't create anything. We lack creative power. Berkeley, however, makes quite clear that we do create the ideas of imagination. So I have a faculty of imagining or representing to myself ideas of those particular things I have perceived. ideas formed by help of memory and imagination, and formed by the imagination again. So he uses the language of creation with respect to the ideas of imagination. So this is a fundamental difference. Berkeley thinks we can create ideas, something that feels interesting. Whereas Collier doesn't. I can no more understand how we can create the objects we imagine than the objects we are said to see. God is certainly the true cause of both. So he says, can't understand how we could create anything ab initio. If you create an idea of imagination, you're taking on a divine power. The divine centaur does not, the imagined centaur does not happen to be so vivid, okay? And that's whereby I distinguish this act, which we call imagination, from the act which we call vision. But why is this? But because the common cause of both, God, does not make the former, the imagined one, as vivid as the latter. So there's no in-principle reason why the difference between them. They both have the same cause. One is caused to be more vivid than the other. So that's the difference in the views. Now, why would Collier and perhaps the Berkeley of the notebooks end up thinking this? Why would you end up thinking that God creates the ideas of imagination and that that's the best solution or response to the argument that we've proved all things a dream? Well, I think to understand this, we have to go back to the core tenets of the view that Berkeley and Collier share. And a good way of getting at this is to start, I always find, is to start with G.E. Moore's famous paper, The Refutation of Idealism, where G.E. Moore, I mean, this was quite an important, sociologically important paper. It did change the direction of at least English-speaking philosophy in the 20th century. And he claimed that idealism arose from the failure to separate the act of perceiving from the object of perception. He said it's difficult to separate the two in experience, but there is a difference, and once you recognize the difference, that undermines all the arguments for idealism. Now, what's interesting is, again, if we just have a quick look into the notebooks, Berkeley seems to be aware of precisely the point that G.E. Moore is making. He says, distinguishing between an idea and perception of the idea has been one great cause of imagining material substances. So we have here, one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. So it looks like that G.E. Moore is right. The source of idealism is the refusal, rather than the failure, to separate act of perception from object of perception. This refusal to make that separation is a view I've elsewhere called pre-Kantian innocence. Not because the alternative was unavailable before Kant, but it became very hard for philosophers to regain this innocence after Kant. Innocence once lost. No comment. And the pre-Kantian innocence is the idea that perception is presentation, not representation of objects. Okay? In that sense, it's entirely passive. There's no act of mind, no event of reception. This is why it's pre-Kantian. The idea of receptivity being essential becomes fixed in the Western philosophical mind after Kant. It's been there before. We have it in lots of other philosophers, but Kant seems to fix it as a sine qua non in philosophy. Before that, we have philosophers like Berkeley and Collier who seem to be saying there's no event of reception. Okay? But sense perception is not being affected by an object. It's standing in a relation to an object, it is not being affected by an object. So consequently, how things seem to you is not the joint upshot of how the world is and how you are. It depends entirely upon how the world is. Okay? How things seem to you just is how the world is, or bit of world you perceive. So there's no possible role for the subject in determining how things seem to you, how the world appears. And this seems to be endorsed as well by Collier fairly explicitly. So as I said, his first principle is whatever is seen is. Okay. He claims that seeing and imagining are not different in kind, just in degree. So here we have a character he introduces, Apelles. I don't know why he chooses that name from Sextus, but he does. It's supposed already to see a centaur, only we do not use to call it seeing, but imagining, because of the faint and languid manner. So there's a difference of degree only between seeing and imagining. So this first principle applies to imagination just as much as it does to seeing. So that's Collier's view. Of course, there is some act of mind involved in imagining. He doesn't want to deny that there's some sense in which if I say to you, imagine flying over Paris at night, okay, and you'll all conjure up an image of an illuminated Eiffel Tower, there's something happening in your mind. But his view is that volition, to imagine that, is the occasion of what happens, not the cause. God causes those ideas of imagination on the occasion of your volition. So what Collier's doing is he's extending this view, pre-Kantian innocence, to imagination, and incidentally to recollection as well. So he's infallibilist about recollection. In contrast, Berkeley's trying to make a distinction here. The pre-Kantian innocence seems to apply in sense perception, but not in imagination, because the ideas we imagine are created by us. Thus, how it appears to us when we're having these sensory imaginings is a function of what we're doing. We're creating that experience for ourselves and its character. And Berkeley thinks that part of that act is representation. So he says those ideas exciting the imagination are properly termed ideas or images of things which they copy and represent. Incidentally, this is a fascinating and uncommented use of the word properly. So he's actually indicating that when he uses the word idea of a sense perception, he's not using it in the proper sense, where an idea is a synonym of image, which was the early 17th century usage, pre-philosophical usage of those terms. Anyway, they copy and represent. Okay, copy suggests a causal condition. You can only copy something if there's some causal connection between the original and the copy. So resemblance is necessary but not sufficient. And these ideas are framed by one of the diverse operations of the mind. So we have some faculty, it's unexplained there, which allows us to create ideas which causally depend upon what they represent. So they're copies of what they represent. So this is where we've ended up with the different comparison between the two views. And this is about to be where we get to the interesting point. Collier, we can't create things. An object of the imagination, an imagined centaur, is a centaur. We can't create centaurs, so God must create it. Berkeley, we can't create centaurs. The object of the imagination is an idea of a centaur, an idea that represents a centaur. It isn't a centaur. And so we can create an idea which represents a centaur, which isn't a centaur. That's the fundamental difference between the two. Now, I mean, the problems with Collier's views should be completely obvious. Okay, one, it's crazy. That's a big picture. It makes David Lewis seem to be mainstream common sense. Everything you imagine being, God creates it. Two, it also creates a particularly vicious form of the problem of evil. Okay, I can imagine some pretty evil things.
So
that's going to occasion God to actually make those things happen. So pretty vicious form of the problem of evil. What about Berkeley's view? Well, to us it can seem pretty much like common sense, pretty obvious. But it actually has a problem within Berkeley's system. So it's just two ontological categories, spirits and ideas. So ideas of sense and ideas of imagination are ontologically the same. They're the same kind of entity. Okay? The only difference between them rests in their cause. Okay? And of course, the cause might make a sequence of one more strong or even coherent, but that's a consequence of the cause having greater capacities. Let's assume, even if we assume that our volitions are transparent to the subject, okay? If we assume that, then it's fairly easy to distinguish an idea of imagination and an idea of sense. If you can tell when you've willed it, you're going to know which is which. So that's not the problem for Berkeley. It's not that he's going to confuse imaginings with sense perceptions. He's got epistemic access to that distinction in his view. The problem is that it undermines the response to skepticism. Because the response to skepticism was, in sense perception, you have infallible knowledge of the real world. Okay? Sense perception gives you that, as in Berkeley's phrase, perfect knowledge. Okay? But now, the phenomenal character, how it seems to you in a sense perception, no longer guarantees that what you're experiencing is the real world. Because there could be an imagining just like that for Berkeley. We could create an imagined idea, which is exactly the same to the subject. The difference would be in the causing. So the anti-skeptical move now in Berkeley has to rest entirely on an inference about the causation. Berkeley's no longer able to say that sense perception just directly presents you with the real world and that is the solution to skepticism. He's broken that argument and instead he has to infer from the fact that your sense, the ideas of sense are not caused by you, to they're caused by something external, to there's something, and so on. But one, that's a pretty weak argument. And two, even worse, it's available to the materialist, the representative realist. It gives no special advantage to his view. So the problem for Berkeley is his view of imagination undermines his claim that immaterialism is an anti-skeptical doctrine. It just puts him in the same position as a representative realist, as a Lockean. So that's where we are now. We've got Collier. His view is highly consistent with his principles. The man was one for consistency. Okay? I will outsmart any objection to use Dennett's dictionary, but it's wildly implausible. Berkeley's view is very plausible to the extent of seeming obviously true, but it's inconsistent with his claim to principle that he has the solution to immaterialism, that his account of perception solves that problem. So at that point, we've kind of done the history. We've done the exegesis, we understand where we are, we understand the pressures on these two philosophers. At this point, I'm afraid my philosophical brain kicks in. And I desperately want to know, can an idealist like Berkeley or Collier give a satisfactory account of sensory imagination? Okay? We've seen that both of them try and fail. So was there an alternative available for them? Okay, and at this point we're going to move away from Berkeley studies, Collier studies, and just do a little bit of philosophy of mind. See if we can construct a reasonably plausible account of sensory imagination, which would avoid the problems that both Collier and Berkeley face, and also be consistent with the Berkeley-Collier anti-skeptical argument. I think we can. There's the promise. I'm going to do it in 5 minutes, so you're going to have to ask for more details.
Imagination explained.
Okay. So the basic idea is this. What both Berkeley and Collier and most of our contemporaries and most philosophers, but not all, have assumed is that sensory imagining flying over Paris at night, on a clear night, is some kind of experience. It's in the way of experiencing something. So if we deny that, if we say, well, imagining isn't experiencing, it isn't a species of experiencing, it's a species of thinking about experiences. Okay, so it's not experiencing, it's thinking about experiences. Okay, so think of this example. When I hope, given a glass of Sancerre, that the wine will taste of gooseberries, I'll have that lovely gooseberry flavour. When I'm hoping that, I don't experience the taste. Okay, hoping for an experience is not a way of experiencing. Otherwise, I'd save a lot of money. But it's having an attitude towards a possible experiencing. So what we want to say is, the same would be if I imagine it. If I imagine what the wine's going to taste like, that's not a way of experiencing a second grade experience. It's a way of thinking about an experience. It is an attitude towards an experience. Okay, so here's the first thought. You sensorially imagine something, if and only if you think in a certain way we're going to specify, so a very specific way of thinking about a possible experiencing of that thing. Okay, so when I imagine what the wine is going to taste like, I'm thinking in a very, very distinctive way about a possible tasting. Okay, and then when the reality disappoints, we've got a failure of match between possible and actual. When it doesn't disappoint, we get a match. Okay, so that's the first move. Separate, get rid of that assumption that sensory imagining is experiencing. It's thinking about experiencing. So what is this particular way of experiencing? Well, the crucial thing is it can't be a propositional attitude, because then we lose the distinction between sensory imagining and mere imagining that something happens. Because there's a crucial distinction between that sensory imagining what the wine is going to taste like, or the mezcal, and imagining that it will taste a certain way. You can imagine that it will taste a certain way, and that's a very different sort of mental process. So it's not a propositional attitude. And what I think we need to do to get this distinctive way of thinking is notice that philosophy of mind has had one arm tied behind its back, because it thinks the only way of thinking is propositional attitudes. It's directed towards something truth valuable, a whole proposition. But it looks like we have a capacity to think in a way which is directed not towards propositions, but the elements of propositions, concepts. Conceptual attitudes. We can think about a concept. Okay? And while propositional attitudes are attitudes towards the truth of a proposition, I believe that it is true, I hope that it will be true, I fear that it's true. It looks like conceptual attitudes can't be towards the truth of a concept, concepts aren't true. So I just kind of said the reality, just to give us a term to use here. Okay, and the thought is, when I have a conceptual attitude towards a proposition, I have an attitude towards towards a concept. Okay, I'm thinking that concept is or might be or can be real. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what real is. The crucial point, though, is that this conceptual attitude isn't reducible towards an attitude towards a proposition which contains the concept, because it's not better linguistic. And we'll see that played out in the next one. So the thought is, some concept is real if and only if some thoughts which entail that there are Fs are one, true, and two, of practical benefit. So we want to, seconds to rule out gerrymander concepts. Okay? So the thought is, take the concept oak tree. that's real in this way of thinking about concepts, because there are some thoughts which entail there are oak trees, which are true. Okay. Magdalen wood is an oak wood. Entails there are oak trees. And also, that concept has some practical benefits. There is some use to us being able to distinguish oak trees from elm trees in their better boats, better reasons. Okay. On this notion of conceptual reality, it's going to be sufficient for a concept that it picks out a natural kind, an instantiated natural kind. It's sufficient for it to fail to be real, that it's vacuous, doesn't apply to anything. It's not necessary that there's some universal, but it's not sufficient that it's instantiated. Okay, so we can all create gerrymandered concepts which have no practical consequences. So that's why, I mean, this is just a definition to allow us to articulate what sensory imagining is. So here we go. Here's the view that Berkeley and Collier should have had as imagination. To sensorily imagine something is to have the conceptual attitude, a particular conceptual attitude of sensory imagining, called I star, towards the concept of perceiving that thing. So it's a concept of perceiving. Okay, goes back to Enrique's point. If you accept this, animals which lack the concept of perception can't engage in sensory imagination, because you have to have an attitude towards the concept of perceiving, not towards the thing. And then what's the attitude? Well, it's sui generis, it's not going to be reduced to anything else. The modality is possibly real. Okay? So when I sensorily imagine the taste of the wine, my attitude towards that perceiving, that tasting, is that it's possibly real. Okay? It's a possible tasting. The subject must have the concept of perception, as well as the concept of the F, whatever that might be. Sorry, the light button is underneath. I've not had a click light. And when we elaborate on the concept of the imagining, if someone starts talking about what they're imagining, okay, they're going to elaborate on the object of the possible perception. Because what they're doing is they're thinking that the concept, perceiving an F, is possibly real. So it's possibly instantiated and useful. So if you ask them, come on, tell me more about what you're imagining, they're going to tell you more about the thing that is possibly perceived. So that's the view that Berkeley and Collier should have had, from my view. It gets out of the problems because perception remains the only case where you're actually experiencing something. In the case of imagination, you're thinking about possibly experiencing. And so that's sufficient difference to ground the skeptical argument. Thank you. And that is just a little
Well, as you see, it's a very interesting paper. And for me, it's really difficult to make some questions that are really significant. But I'll try. Well, you say on page 2 that Berkeley and Collier share a metaphysical position that separates the question of realism from the question of existence of matter, but differ in the kind of arguments they employ and forcefulness of these arguments. And you really try very hard to demonstrate that for us. And I really very happy to see the thing as clear as that. And you explain that the separation of ideas of sense and ideas of imagination is strongly advocating PHK principles of human knowledge when Berkeley explains that we cause ideas of imagination but no those of senses. Do you think that this implies the advance of psychological explanation in the realm of epistemology? Do you want to answer or?
Should we get to the end, or
No,
which
no,
would you
no.
prefer?
I can continue, but if you prefer. You say that Collier maintains that the imagined things are real and declares the existence of imagined objects. I think that from this point of view, there is a very big difference between Berkeley and Collier. And what is your view about when you showed that very, very well, but it was my claim there. With respect to the problem of existence, you say that for Berkeley, the objects of the senses and imagination exists both, because both are ideas, but only the objects of senses are part of nature. All ideas are mental since they are created by the mind and exist when perceived, but ideas of imagination are created by our will. So my question here is, if we can conclude that the ideas of sense perception are created, yes, you have demonstrated that by the will of God. This is important because of Collier's conclusion that God certainly is the true cause of both imagined objects and sense objects, and that God explains for him why he can affirm the very existence of both kinds of ideas. May I continue?
Yes, please.
Something that seems difficult to maintain for Berkeley is the difference between moral dependence and causal dependence. How can causal dependence make it that some of our ideas can be considered as real objective ideas? Mm-hmm. I know that all the Semites answer, but when I read it the first time, it strikes me so. As for the ideas of imagination, it is difficult to believe, you say, that an anti-skeptical argument can be based on the involuntariness of sense perception. So you explain that Berkeley's argument is not sufficient to face skepticism because nothing can ensure that something that appears as involuntary to perception is real. Mm-hmm. Well, you consider the objection that sensory imagining has a phenomenal character, very similar to that of perceiving, so there is no distinctive type of phenomenal character to be applied to sensory imagining. But if we can demonstrate that sensory imagining has a specific phenomenal character, we can say the philosophy of esse es percipit. ¿No? Bueno, finally, in fact, you think that Berkeley's and Collier's view that the perceiving of something is sufficient for the real existence of that thing, which is the kind of pre-Kantian innocence you claim, really avoids skepticism about our contact with the world. Nevertheless, the problem of imagination is not completely resolved, but you make a very interesting effort, and I congratulate you about that. Thanks. That is all. Oh, my dear.
Thank you very much for those interesting and thoughtful questions. Are you okay if I reply to a few of them and before we have some more? I don't think I'm going to be able to cover every point.
Oh,
but
you get
only
the ones
I will pick the ones where I have something to say
and
pretend
that really are significant because not all of them are significant.
Well, I think it's more a matter of I'll gloss over the things I can't deal with. I'm going to start with what was your fifth question and related to your first. You said, so Berkeley needs this distinction between modal dependence and causal dependence because both ideas of imagination and sense are modally dependent on the perceiver. They wouldn't exist were they not perceived, but one's causally dependent and the other isn't. And you started by pointing out that I'd said that one of the commonalities between Berkeley and Collier is separating realism from the existence of matter. And I think these two are connected. And I think there's a very lazy assumption in a lot of philosophy that realism or objectivity of our sense perception and the modal independence of those are one and the same thing. Mm-hmm. That we can slide from questions of modality to questions of objectivity and backwards. Mm-hmm. But it's far from obvious that those are equivalent. Mm-hmm. And so what's distinctive about the Berkeley-Collier view of perception is that they shelve the question of modal dependence for a bit. Mm-hmm. And they say when you're perceiving, sense perceiving, you are presented with something other than you. Mm-hmm. And so they take that to be the basic character of sense perception. And so they've got a sense of what it is for objectivity to be, which they can introduce before they raise the modal question. And I think this is a really distinctive approach to philosophy, but it means you have to start with a careful phenomenology of sense perception. Perhaps more careful than either ever gives in their written works. So the thought is, if you start with the careful phenomenology of sense perception, you can leave the question of modal dependence and also perhaps the question of causation, because that depends on recognizing your volitions, on one side and ask, is this an experience in which I'm presented with something other to me? And I think that's what they're trying to do. Then they come in with the questions of modal dependence. Then we ask about the nature of the thing that we've experienced. And in both cases, they have slightly different arguments that it's modally dependent upon being experienced. And the causal dependence, that looks like that's a separate question. Did I cause it? Did something else cause it? With the background assumption that there must be a cause. So I think those 2 points are closely related. And what I take from, one of the reasons I love reading Berkeley and Collier is precisely because here I'm being pointed towards some philosophers who are making a distinction which just about all our contemporaries fail to make. So I think that's fascinating. I think that the kind of second really big question that you raised, which was also connects very much to your own interests and your own paper yesterday, was this question about psychological explanation in epistemology.
Yes, I love it.
Very interesting question. So it is the case that on Berkeley's account of imagination, the epistemology of the real world depends upon us being able to recognize our own psychological processes that underlie imagination. We must recognize imagining for imagining. And so he has brought that really interesting move into his philosophy at that point. There needs to be a capacity to correctly categorize our own mental states and processes, and that underlies his approach to realism. So I think that is really a good point. It's not one I thought about specifically, but I think it's an excellent point and a very interesting feature of Berkeley's philosophy. Yeah, and perhaps one why so many people think he's some kind of subjective idealist. They're responding to this thought. And we ought to be skeptical of our ability actually to correctly identify whether we're imagining or not. Well, the Perky experiments may not be the best case, but there are plenty of cases where we're not sure whether we've imagined something, dreamt it, remembered it. We can be confused about those categories. So it's a serious weakness in Berkeley's pure normative epistemology that he does this. And I'm going to just then leap to your last point, which is, what if we could show that sensory imagining had a distinctive phenomenal character? So that actually there was some way that things were presented to us in sensory imagination, which allowed us to tell that this wasn't a sense perception, independently of the question of how it was caused. Mm-hmm. I think that would certainly solve the problem.
Of course.
I'm very skeptical, or just generally, that we would be able to do that. In the sense, okay, so no, I need to reverse that point. If sensory imagining was experiencing, then there'd be no reason to expect that you always get a phenomenal difference between the two. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think perhaps that was rather forcefully made by Jonathan Bennett when he was criticizing Hume's account in this area. No, there's just no, in principle, reason why what you imagine has to be less vivid than what you perceive. You can have kind of vague and not very vivid perceptions, and you can have very vivid imaginings. So I think if you have the experiential model, then you're going to say it's very hard to believe that there's going to be a principled phenomenal distinction. On the other hand, I do want to say that if you accepted my view, or the view I've presented of imagining, then there really is a very strong phenomenal difference. So actually, if we have this gut instinct that there is a very big phenomenal difference between imagining something and perceiving it, then the view I articulated at the end would explain that better than an experiential view.
So, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So, please.
Okay, so thanks for this wonderful paper, Tom, and thanks for your comments, Laura. I just wanted to pick up on something you said right at the very end,
Right.
Tom, which was like, if this were true, then we would have a solution. Let's go back. So you said, ideas of sense and imagination are different for Berkeley, but you focus on the cause. That's the difference. That seems to me. I mean, when I'm looking at, that's PHK 30. The ideas of sense are more strong, lively, and distinct than those of the imagination. Blah blah blah. They testify to the admirable connection, whereas sufficiently. They testify to the wisdom and benevolence of her authors. So he's focusing on two things, right? One is the strength, liveliness, and distinctness, and their causation. You mentioned the first, you move on to the second, and it's as if the first part didn't really matter. It's the second that matters. When Berkeley turns to the same point in the dialogues, in the third dialogue, he says he really focuses on the former rather than the latter. He says the ideas formed by the imagination are faint and indistinct. They have, besides, an entire dependence on the will. But the ideas perceived by sense, that is, real things, are more vivid and clear, and being imprinted on the mind by a spirit distinct from us, have not a like dependence on our will. So I'm wondering now whether you could just focus on the first and just say, look, this is his answer to the problem, is that you have strength, orderliness, and coherence in the one case. You have faint, languid, incoherence in the case of imagination. If you then say, yeah, but I think at some point you said something like, yeah, but look, we could create imagined ideas just like sense ideas and so on. Berkeley has an answer, or at least so far, so I can see in the same passage. He says, there's no danger of confounding these with the foregoing, and there's as little of confounding them with the visions of a dream, which are dim, irregular, and confused. And though they should happen to be never so lively and natural, so even if you thought like lively and naturalness would be the way to go, yet by their not being connected and of a piece with the preceding and subsequent transactions of our lives, they might easily be distinguished from realities. So there's the importance of connection with the, I'm thinking this is really his answer, not the business about being caused by some external.
So it's an excellent point, and I think the question really relies on what you mean by is really his answer. So yes, Berkeley is a historical figure, is quite persuaded by that, the thought that imaginings, dreamings lack some of these effectively relational properties that the experienced world does. And he's quite struck by that. But he also has this other element, the referring to the causation. The problem is that the first is a very weak answer to the problem, whereas the second is a stronger answer to the problem, which also explains the first. So there's the combination of whether he's actually right. So for example, what must be a fairly common experience is you need to reply to an email. The next day, you've got a memory of replying to the email. Did you dream it or did you do it? Okay. The point about that is if you dreamt it, which is quite often the case, good classic anxiety dream, the dream fits perfectly into the experienced world until we come up against go and check your outbox sort of thing. But at that point, so you can't tell at that point. So it looks like, the criteria he picks up, equally, the orderliness, the coherence, we can create artificial situations where people's actual sense experience goes haywire, and equally, and so on. So these aren't very strong criteria, whereas the differences he does point to are explained by the differences in the causes of the different experience of imagining and perceiving. So it seems to me that Berkeley has two moves here. He overplays the weak one and underplays the strong one. What does he really think? Well, I think if he was sitting here, he'd say, yeah, I really want the volitional one. That's what really matters, because that's going to make things work. So that's my response. So I'm kind of, yeah.
Enrique?
Era primero.
Steve? Did you want to?
No, I think
No,
Enrique
was
is second.
Enrique. Quincy?
Happy to defer.
Oh, okay, well, then, quick question. I take it that you really don't believe that the self exists apart from its perceivings. And so, you kind of ran through that at the beginning and rather quick.
Yeah.
And so what I'm wondering is when we perceive a table, we really don't perceive a table in its entirety like God perceives the table. Rather, we perceive part of the table or from a perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means, or at least what the implication of that is that since I don't really perceive the table, but rather a view or a perspective of the table, then it seems like the partiality of that perspective is what reflexively identifies the self. That is, I'm the one who perceives a particular aspect of the table, and that particularity defines me in the perceiving. And so I'm wondering whether all the stuff you added at the end really applies to treating myself as something more global, as more total, rather than partial. And I would want to suggest that it's the partial part that we really need to be focusing in on. So I can certainly make the distinction between imagining and perceiving, and saying one is regular, however you handle the issue about whether it's source of. But I'm going to go back to what effect does it have on the recognition of the self as a part, always a partial.
Yeah.
And that's what, and the partiality might be defined more or less in imagination versus perceiving.
Yeah. So just a footnote. One of the reasons I didn't talk about the self in this paper is because it's a point where Berkeley and Collier diverge massively. And Collier's view of the self is very, very different from Berkeley's. And that's what the specimen of true philosophy is about. So if you buy me a mezcal, I'll explain to you what that crazy view is. So that's on just footnote about why I was not focusing on that, because I wanted to leave that on one side. I am inclined to agree to some extent with what you said about Berkeley's view of the self, though perhaps I think it's also consistent with a Cartesian approach, given we treat action if we treated action as a Cartesian principal attribute. So I think we can connect the two. So the question, though, you were focusing on at this point is, in a sense, identify ourselves, perhaps individuate ourselves in terms of the partiality of perception. And I think that's a really insightful way of giving. So, if Berkeley's choices are either, in my view, either some sort of principal attribute view of the self, or some sort of no attributes view of the self, and then all these things inherent in it. Either way, he's going to have trouble distinguishing me from you until he looks at the differences in our stream of sense perceptions. And so I agree entirely that that's going to be absolutely foundational. I don't think it impacts much on the anti-skeptical argument. That's a different question. So I think really the bottom line is, yeah, I agree about Berkeley, but Collier is going to have a very different approach to this.
Y bueno, brevemente, señor.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tom. That was brilliant, and thank you, Laura. You had some very incisive points. So, just quickly, does Collier say anything about animals, and can animals imagine? I think it's an unfair question because that's not the topic.
Yeah.
And the other is, and perhaps I'm missing something here, but what sense of imagination does Berkeley have in mind, right? For example, I think that the modern sense of imagination, right, as being able to contemplate alternative possibilities, I think that it was born, right, with Descartes, but in Descartes, right, his conception of imagination, right, he calls it a special way of thinking about material things, right? Alternatively, he says that the imagination is nothing but thinking about the figure, right, of a material thing. And that's a very different conception from our more modern sense of imagination. So
I think Berkeley's taking his conception of imagination straight from Hobbes, straight from Book 1 of the Leviathan. I mean, I think that's where we've got imagination is a genus of psychological processes which includes memory and various other psychological processes. So I think that's I mean, just historically where that is, and that's not Cartesian.
yeah,
Absolutely. One of the interesting things is when talking about imagination, he uses the term imagination and imagining. When using the imagination in arguments, he talks about what we can conceive as possible. So he clearly is thinking of it in terms of a relation to a possibility rather than. Yeah, he's not at all Cartesian in that respect. Collier on animals, he says almost nothing about. He rarely mentions animals, but he does. He does have a very weird. Again, we'd have to go through the details of his metaphysics of mind, but he has a weird hierarchy of minds contained within others. And he does think that when we perceive an animal, it's somehow within our the animal, the being, and not just its physical properties, is somehow dependent upon us. So, but he never goes into any detail about that. You just infer that from a couple of examples he gives.
Here, the last question.
Okay. So I guess I'm trying to understand the problem that you think Berkeley is trying to solve, because I'm sure everyone has this impression when you teach Berkeley, students are really interested in the distinction between imaginary things and real things. But they're not interested, I don't think, in the question that you're asking. They're like Gates. They think that Berkeley is saying everything is filmy and fake. So what I don't see is, why would you think Berkeley wants to give us a way to tell, to know, for example, whether you dreamed about the email or really have written the email? Wouldn't in theory be too powerful if it could? I mean, wouldn't it be a bad thing if there were a way of distinguishing the feeling of having done an email from really having done an email?
So I think, that kicks into the epistemology of memory, which is very underdeveloped in Berkeley. But I think Berkeley does want something which is incredibly powerful in the anti-skeptical sphere. So this is what he keeps telling us in the subtitles of books and the prefaces, that this is what he's doing. He's rejecting skepticism. And he has a very distinctive, he has a very specific version of skepticism in mind, which is not just Cartesian skepticism. It's not particularly Cartesian skepticism. And he thinks he has just managed to show that is incorrect. And so, and the way he does that is through the infallibility of the senses. And so there must be some way, so it must be absolutely crucial that he can make this distinction between when we are having a sense perception and when we're not.
This is a Mescal conversation.
Well,
Well, thank you.
thank you very much.